When we talk about India's IT success story, we usually jump straight to Bangalore, startups, outsourcing, and billion-dollar tech giants. But what if I told you? India's IT revolution didn't begin with software. It began with fear, borders, and a very deliberate decision to stop relying and start building.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Info Rush, where curiosity meets clarity. I'm Rudrakshi,
I am Disha.
and welcome to our very first episode, Atmanirbhar, before it was cool. Before getting right into the story, we are finally starting with our podcast, Disha. How do you feel about it?
Really excited, especially about the topic that we'll be covering in this series. Can't wait to begin.
Exactly. Let's dive into it. This is episode 1 of India Including, and today we're going back all the way to the 1960s. Picture India in the 1960s, fresh out of independence, still finding its footing, surrounded by geopolitical tension, border conflicts with China, wars with Pakistan, and a growing realization that technology, especially computers and electronics, wasn't just about development, it was about national security. Back then, computers weren't laptops and desks, they were massive machines, strategic assets, and almost entirely controlled by foreign companies.
So, wait, how massive were these machines?
Just imagine a single computer filling an entire air conditioned room and hard disk. You know what hard disk are?
Yes, the one where computers store data.
Right. Tiny today, but back then they were the size of washing machines, and results didn't come within a second like today, but took hours and sometimes even days.
Wow, that's really long.
Yes, I know, right? Now, going back to national security. For India, dependence on imported technology felt risky. So the question was simple but bold. Can India build its own technological future? To answer this question, it is crucial we talk about a man who didn't just want India to consume tech, he wanted India to build it. Most people know him as the father of the space program, but he was also one of the founders of India's most prestigious institute, IIM Ahmedabad, and I'm talking about none other than Dr. Vikram Sarabhai. In the 1960s, the government created an electronics committee. As the head of the electronics committee, succeeding Dr. Homi Bhabha, he laid down a roadmap where he wasn't just talking about gadgets. He was canvassing for research, efficiency, and exports. He even fought for a separate ministerial wing for electronics and probably why the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology exists. It is crucial that we talk about this committee because the story starts not with code but with conflict. We are going back to the post independence era when national security and border conflicts drove India's first tech policy, a strategy called indigenization and self sufficiency.
So, Atmanirbhar, but before it was cool.
Absolutely right. This self sufficiency wasn't aimed to be achieved within a span of 10 years. This was not supposed to be a gradual shift. The committee wanted to fast track this process. They wanted to skip the intermediate steps and leapfrog to the most advanced tech available. But there was a massive problem. The computer market was completely dominated by one player, the big blue, IBM. And this is where the government's vision first hits the wall of reality. India tried to get IBM to share equity with local capital, a foundational requirement for indigenization, and IBM basically said, no, we'd rather leave. And the government at that time backed down.
So, to simplify, what the government wanted was for IBM to join hands with a local company.
Right, not only that, but the early regulations of domestic production actually backfired. Instead of getting the latest tech, companies like IBM and British owned ICL, International Computers Limited, were refurbishing used computers in Indian plants and selling them. The government's attempts to control things actually led to more technological backwardness. Moreover, the early agencies just lacked the authority, technical competence, and staff to effectively regulate these giant MNCs.
Let me get this right. India's IT journey began not with software, but with national security concerns and a drive for self reliance. Led by the Electronics Committee, the government aimed to indigenize technology fast, but faced resistance from IBM and early regulatory missteps.
Precisely. But the software boom of the 1990s, it didn't come out of nowhere. It grew from decades of policy debates, hard lessons, and early experiments. Some successful, some not. This was India laying the groundwork. Messy, imperfect, but intentional. That's today's info rush. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and log out smarter. When we left off last time, India's first attempt of self reliance in technology had hit a wall. IBM wouldn't play ball, early regulations backfired, and the government was learning the hard way that ambition alone wasn't enough.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Info Rush, where curiosity meets clarity. I am Disha,
I am Rudrakshi.
and welcome to our second episode, The Powerpuff Play. Today, we are diving into the 1970s, a period when India decided to take control of its own tech destiny, not just on paper, but in practice. After facing criticism from other government agencies and then private sector, the Indian government realized that it needed a stronger, more focused approach. And so they created two key bodies, the Department of Electronics and the Electronics Commission. One of the first bold moves was the creation of the Santa Cruz Electronics Export Processing Zone, or SEEPS, located in Mumbai. It offered huge incentives, tax breaks, duty free imports, but the crucial requirement was all or most production must be exported. This was India's first major blueprint for a global services export hub.
I usually see a lot of crowd every morning near SIPs, like I travel to office every day, as every Mumbaiker would do, and I always wondered what it really was. Now it all makes sense.
Exactly, so now you know. Second, they created the state owned Electronics Corporation of India Limited, ESIL, for mini computer production. With ESIL getting almost all of the government's computer development funding, the government essentially created a monopoly for ESIL in the small mini market, starving private competitors of licenses because it was the Department of Electronics which had the power over the licensing of computer imports. As a result, ESIL could capture up to half of the market. Sounds like a success story, right? Not quite. ESIL struggled to deliver computers that met global standards, falling short on technological innovation, cost efficiency, and production timelines. Indigenization had an execution problem this time. All of this was setting the stage for the final act of the 1970s, a dramatic showdown with IBM, using a powerful regulation called FERA, the Foreign Exchange Regulations Act. Using FERA, the government demanded that foreign companies dilute their equity to 40% in their Indian operations, which meant that if a foreign company like IBM wanted to keep doing business in India, they were no longer allowed to own the whole company. Their ownership would be capped to 40%, and the other 60% would be that of Indian partners joining hands with Indian firms.
I think I kind of know, like, even when you look at Starbucks, sign you see a Tata company written
Exactly.
down. So yeah,
Yes. So it's a joint venture.
yeah. It's interesting to know that SEEPs in a way pioneered India's export-led services model, setting the template for India's integration into global value chains. Also, I get it now. DOE, Electronics Commission, and FERA, the three Powerpuff girls, were proving a force to be reckoned with.
Yes, exactly. ICL gave in on the equity issue, but guess who was acting like a stubborn landlord, refusing to hand over the keys to the property, even as the laws were being rewritten around them? The Big Blue,
Hmm.
IBM. While negotiations with IBM dragged on, and just as they were about to reach a conclusion, two major developments changed the game entirely. And that's where we'll pick up in the next episode. That's today's Info Rush. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and log out smarter. When we left off in episode 2, India was locked in a tense standoff with a multinational giant and a country trying to assert control over its own IT destiny.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Info Rush, where curiosity meets clarity. I am Rudrakshi,
I am Disha.
and this is episode 3, The Big Blue Void. Today, we are stepping into a period that set the stage for India's software boom. As mentioned in the last episode, two major developments changed the landscape that year. First, they had a new foreign partner. In 1975, Burroughs entered a joint venture with Tata Consultancy Services to export software from SEEPs. The government had leverage. ICL, as previously mentioned, had agreed on the FERA requirement of equity dilution. This was significant. For the first time, the government had two multinational corporations, ICL and Burroughs, operating on India's terms. It gave policymakers the confidence to take a hard line against IBM. Second, the Indian government created the state owned Computer Maintenance Corporation, CMC, with legal monopoly on the maintenance of all foreign computer systems in India. IBM's competitive edge, its superior service, was neutralized. Now, any user of IBM system would depend on CMC for maintenance. India's bargaining position was stronger this time. The government continued to demand IBM to dilute its equity to 40%. IBM tried to negotiate, offering to share equity in non computer operations, meet export goals, and even fund an Indian Science Center and an electronics testing facility. The government refused. After 2 years of negotiations, IBM decided it could not back down, and in 1978, it quit India altogether. IBM's exit was a seminal moment. It demonstrated the government's ability to reshape the IT industry and assert control over multinational corporations. But why did India go all in on a showdown with IBM? It wasn't about pushing a global giant out for the sake of it. The government realized that making exceptions for IBM would weaken its ability to negotiate with other multinationals and undermine its policy of self reliance. IBM's exit left a massive vacuum. This void became the ultimate breeding ground for giants. The government won the battle of self sufficiency, but they also lost access to cutting edge technology. It was like winning the keys to a mansion only to find the previous owner took all the furniture and cut the power lines on the way out. We had thousands of computers across the country, no spare parts, no official support, and no one to call when things went sideways. But as the saying goes, opportunity often hides in a crisis. And that's exactly what a new breed of entrepreneurs saw. IBM's departure didn't just clear the deck for ESL, it opened the door for private Indian firms. ESL, however, could not produce competitive products, and the Department of Electronics faced criticism for blocking private sector innovation and favoring ESL at the expense of users. In response, the government allowed private firms to produce data processing systems and import components, giving the domestic market room to breathe. By the end of the 1970s, local private firms like HCL, DCM, and NOR began to emerge as major suppliers.
The IBM exit marked a turning point. The TCS Burroughs deal and CMC led monopoly on the maintenance of all foreign computer systems in India made this possible. While this exit resulted in a temporary technological vacuum, it forced a pivot toward private sector innovation when state owned enterprises like ESIL failed to meet demand. Ultimately, the departure served as a structural catalyst, compelling the emergence of a domestic IT industry and laying the foundation for India's future indigenous technological growth.
And just like that, the stage was set for India's software revolution. Companies like TCS weren't just servicing local needs, they were exporting software to the world, laying the foundation for the IT boom of the 1980s and 1990s. That's today's info rush. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and log out smarter. When we talk about India's software boom today, we imagine startups, code, campuses, and global clients. But rewind to the 1950s and 60s, and here's the twist: there was no Indian software industry.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Info Rush, where curiosity meets clarity. I am Disha,
I am Rudrakshi.
and this is episode 4, Trendsetters. And today we are talking about the unlikely birth of Indian software and the people who set the trend. In the early decades, software wasn't a product, it was a free add on. Multinational hardware giants like IBM from the US and ISIL from the UK sold computers to Indian firms, and software came bundled with the machine. Operating systems, basic programs, mostly written in Fortran and COBOL. Fortran was used mainly for scientific and engineering calculations, while COBOL was designed for business tasks like payroll, inventory, and accounting. In short, Fortran helped scientists crunch numbers, and COBOL helped companies run their books.
While you talk about hardware, software, I was just trying to visualize the computers back then. We have, in fact, talked about this in our very first episode about how massive these machines were, right?
Yes, and these were called mainframes. Think of a modern kitchen. The mainframe was like having a refrigerator, a dishwasher, a stove, and a tall pantry, all wired together to work as one machine. Today, we each have our own computer. Back then, an entire company, thousands of employees, shared one frame. The mainframe stayed in a secure room, and the employees sat at what can be called as dumb terminals, just a screen and keyboard with no processing power of their own, that were wired to the mainframe. When you typed a command, the mainframe in the other room did the actual work and sent the result back to your screen.
Which would take hours and even days, sometimes, if I'm not wrong.
Exactly. Now, coming back to the 1960s, as globally things began to shift when IBM unbundled software from hardware. By the 1970s, the situation hadn't changed much. Multinationals still dominated hardware. Software was still bundled. So, how did India end up exporting software? Ironically, the answer wasn't innovation, it was foreign exchange pressure. To export software, Indian firms had to design it for globally standard hardware, which in the 1970s meant IBM mainframes. But there was a problem. Import duties on this hardware were nearly 300%. So IBM sold India what the companies here could afford: old, refurbished, and often outdated machines. Eventually, the government lowered import duties, but with a condition. Software exporters had to earn back twice the foreign exchange spent on hardware imports within 5 years. The rules were tough, the ecosystem was fragile. But this was the moment the Indian software industry quietly began. And leading the charge was a company that would later define Indian IT: Tata Consultancy Services. Founded in 1968, TCS became India's first software exporting company. After a few domestic projects, it landed its first major export assignment in 1973 developing an inventory control system for an electricity generation unit in Iran. Around the same time, TCS worked with Burroughs Corporation, then the world's second largest hardware company, to develop a hospital information system in the UK. This wasn't just a project, it was a template, a proof that Indian engineers could deliver complex software for global clients remotely, reliably, and at scale. By the early 1980s, despite restrictive policies, India stood out with significant software exports. Around 30 Indian companies had already begun exporting software following suit, and India's edge was clear: cost and English. Lower wages made India cost competitive, and English made it globally accessible.
As global trends moved towards the unbundling of software from hardware, Indian firms faced the high cost of importing standard IBM hardware. This forced early pioneers, most notably the Tata Consultancy Services (TCS), to look towards international markets. This period established the Indian IT template, a model based on high skilled labor, cost competitiveness, and export oriented growth.
However, this wasn't a boom yet, it was the warm up. The trendsetters had arrived, and the world was about to take notice. That's today's info rush. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and log out smarter. By the early 1980s, India had found its edge: lower costs and a workforce fluent in English. And it seemed India had finally secured a lane on the global technology highway. But that didn't mean the road was smooth.
Hello everyone, welcome back to InfoRush, where curiosity meets clarity. I am Rudrakshi,
I am Disha.
and this is episode 5, A Bumpy Ride. Today's story is about the bumpy ride the Indian IT industry faced and how the rocky road gave way to one of the world's largest tech industries. Despite its advantages, the Indian software industry faced two massive problems. First, hardware scarcity. Importing computers, especially mainframes, was expensive, slow, and wrapped in red tape. You couldn't code at scale if you couldn't even get your hands on a machine. Second, a skills gap. India was producing brilliant engineers, but very few colleges taught computers or software. Talent existed, training didn't. And then, three seemingly unrelated events changed everything. The first was political. As mentioned in the previous episodes, in the late 1970s, the Indian government passed a controversial law forcing multinationals to cut their equity in Indian subsidiaries below 50%. As we saw, IBM refused and left. The second shift was technological. The arrival of personal computers in the 1980s dramatically reduced hardware costs. Computing was no longer confined to governments and large corporations. Suddenly, thousands of small firms could exist. The third shift was human and perhaps the most powerful. Since colleges weren't teaching computers, entrepreneurs stepped in. Three young Indians began offering IT training classes in rented schools and college classrooms. That institute was NIIT, National Institute of Information Technology. At the same time, companies like Infosys, Satyam, Mastech, Polaris, Silverline were being founded, not by industrialists but by software professionals with small savings and big ambition. What's often missed in this story is where the money came from. In the early years, private capital was hesitant. Software was new and tangible, hard to collateralize. It was public sector banks and financial institutions that stepped in, providing early capital, long term credit, and the confidence that allowed young software firms to survive their most fragile years. This highlights something bigger. Emerging industries rarely grow on market forces alone. They need capital, policy backing, and institutional belief.
You know what? We have seen this play out before, and we are seeing it again today. Take the government's production linked incentive scheme, the PLI scheme, for instance, which offers financial rewards to companies for increasing domestic manufacturing to boost key sectors like electric vehicles and advanced manufacturing. The logic is familiar: reduce risk, encourage scale, and give domestic firms the runway for takeoff.
In the 1980s, that support helped software firms take their first steps and eventually things began to click. Industry bodies emerged. One of them would become NASSCOM, National Association of Software and Service Companies, and training finally started catching up with demand. But exporting software still looked very different from today. In the early years, software exports meant physical movement. Either the code traveled on floppy disks or the coder did. This model was called body shopping. Indian programmers working on site, often in the US, doing low value but labor intensive tasks like coding and testing. Then came a quiet revolution. In 1985, Texas Instruments, an American semiconductor and electronics company, set up an office in Bangalore with a direct satellite link to the US. In 1989, BSNL, government owned telecom company, commissioned India's first dedicated link to the US. For the first time, work could stay in India and travel digitally. Also, Indian firms slowly moved up the value chain from coding to design. Imagine a company hires Indian software engineers to fix bugs in their program. That's just coding. But over time, Indian firms started designing the software itself, deciding how it should work, what features it should have, and how users would interact with it. It's like moving from just painting someone else's house to architecting and building a house from scratch.
The growth of the Indian IT sector in the 1980s was driven by a unique convergence of geopolitical shifts, technological evolution, and institutional support. The departure of IBM created a domestic vacuum, while the global advent of the personal computer made hardware accessible to smaller firms. Simultaneously, the skills gap was bridged not by traditional universities but by private entrepreneurs like NIIT. This era also saw the birth of firms like Infosys and Mastech. The industry, which initially relied on physically sending programmers to client sites, later transitioned toward the modern offshore delivery model, following the introduction of dedicated satellite links by Texas Instruments and BSNL. This digital infrastructure allowed Indian firms to move up the value chain, transitioning from basic bug fixing to now designing the software.
India wasn't just supplying labor anymore, it was supplying solutions. But history wasn't done testing that claim. Two digits, one date, zero room for error. As the millennium approached, time itself turned into a bug. Legacy systems across the globe began ticking towards failure, and the world was scouring for someone who could fix it. That's today's info rush. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and log out smarter. By the 1990s, India's IT industry had matured, but it was about to hit the global stage in a big way as the digital countdown to chaos began.
Welcome back to Info Rush. I am Disha,
I am Rudrakshi.
and this is episode 6, When the Clock Struck Midnight, the finale of our series where we uncover the digital time bomb of the 90s and the birth of India's IT diaspora. In 1993, the US tightened visa rules. Visas became harder to get, and the new H1 visa required proof that companies paid prevailing wages to immigrant workers.
Oh, so this H1 visa rule isn't something new after all then.
Right. This created a challenge and an opportunity. Indian IT companies began experimenting with a mixed delivery model. Some programmers would work at client sites in the US, others would stay in India working from back offices. The result? Export revenues soared in the 1990s. Wait, can you hear that? Can anyone hear that? That ticking wasn't a clock on the wall, nor was it a ticking time bomb. It was buried deep inside millions of lines of code, written decades earlier, never meant to last this long. As the calendar crept towards midnight, December 31st, 1999, computers across the world were about to face a simple but terrifying question. What happens when the year turns from 99 to 00?
Wait, I was born?
Well, yes, that was quite terrifying. Moving on. Back in the day, computers only saved the last two digits of a year. So 1999 was stored as 99. Simple, right? But what happens when the year turns to 2000? The computers would read it as 00, and suddenly systems from banks to airlines wouldn't know if it was the year 1900 or 2000. Now you might wonder why store just two digits. The two-digit year code traces back to the early days of computing, mostly the 1960s through the 1970s. Here is why it happened. Computers were expensive, and memory or storage was very limited. Every byte counted. To save space, programmers stored years with just the last two digits. Example, 1970 was stored as 70, 1985 as 85. At the time, nobody anticipated computers would still be in heavy use 30, 40 years later. Cut to 1999, a world interconnected more than ever, facing the code crisis called the Y2K.
I guess this is when we had maximum of our relatives like our mamas, chachas, uncles and aunts moving to the US,
Yes,
right?
that's right. That's right. Suddenly, the US, UK, and Canadian markets were desperate for programmers due to the sheer amount of codes that needed correction. At the same time, back home in India, the situation couldn't have been more different. The Indian economy had only just opened up in the early 1990s. Private industry was still small, and for most engineers, there simply weren't enough jobs to go around. Demand for software talent inside India was limited. Salaries were low, and large scale tech projects were rare. For them, going abroad wasn't about ambition alone, it was about opportunity and survival. So when Y2K hit, it wasn't just a technology crisis. It was a moment where global demand collided with India's surplus of skilled but underutilized talent. And that collision changed the trajectory of Indian IT forever. Now let us break down how this crisis was dealt with. First, programs were modified to store full four-digit years instead of two digits. Example, 99 was now stored as 1999 and 00 as 2000. The programmers went through millions of lines of code identifying where dates were used, like in interest calculations, flight schedules, or payroll. They rewrote or patched the code to handle the new century correctly. After fixing, systems were tested with dates like 31st December 1999 to 1st Jan 2000 to make sure they didn't crash. Programmers ran simulations to ensure everything from bank balances to airline schedules worked seamlessly. Some programmers worked on site in the US, directly updating critical systems. Others worked from back offices in India, handling large scale code audits and batch updates. Indian IT professionals filled the gap. The H1 visa quota skyrocketed, and a global IT diaspora was born. By the end of 1999, Indian IT was at an all time high. IPOs of software companies were oversubscribed. Venture capital began flowing into India for the first time.
Hold on. IPOs, VC, these are too many heavy financial jargons. Can you please simplify for me?
Sure. So, an IPO, it is an initial public offering. Imagine a company as a pizza shop that's been doing really well. An IPO is when the shop decides to sell tiny slices of itself to the public so anyone can become a part owner. in proportion to the slices that they have bought. When Indian software companies went public, people rushed to buy these slices, showing huge excitement and trust in the industry. Venture capital is like a group of investors giving money to a promising startup pizza shop, hoping it will grow big and bring them a profit. In the late 1990s, foreign investors started putting money into Indian IT firms for the first time, helping them expand faster and take on global projects. So, all in all, the Indian IT industry had arrived globally, and its influence would only grow from there.
And that brings us to the end of our journey. From the 1960s to the brink of the new millennium, we started with fear, borders, and a bold idea. Could India build its own technological future? From the first electronics committee to ESL, TCS, and the early software exporters, we saw how vision, policy, and persistence laid the foundation. We followed the rise of entrepreneurs who turned scarcity into opportunity as IBM's exit marked a turning point. Training institutes, small startups, taking on giants, and the public sector banks that provided the lifeline for India's first IT pioneers. We witnessed the industry scale, adapt, and innovate from body shopping programmers to offshoring and then moving up the value chain from coding to design and finally the Y2K crisis.
The story is clear. India didn't just follow trends, it created them. It was decades of policy, vision, and talent. And today, when we talk about Indian IT, global leaders, billion-dollar exports, and innovation hubs like Bangalore, we are witnessing the legacy of those first pioneers. That's the story of India's IT revolution and how India Inc. loaded onto the global stage bite by bite. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and log out smarter.